I'm so happy to be here to speak with you from New York this evening. Thank you to Laura and Elizabeth and Humanities Texas for coordinating, and thanks for extending your day to be here together with us. Utopia is something I teach a lot at all levels, college and graduate level. I regularly teach a large lecture on Utopia for the Common Core program at NYU. And so this is a huge class that includes students from across all colleges of the institutions. So it's a topic that I found is a really great way for me to bring my knowledge and skills as an English professor and as a literature person to students who, by and large, aren't majoring in English and may not have even a particular interest in studying literature or reading fiction, but through this gen ed curriculum, it's like my opportunity to kind of connect with them on that terrain. I also teach Utopia in the graduate classroom with extreme specialists. So I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to kind of see how these texts work at multiple levels of the university curriculum. And I've thought a lot about how to talk to you about how you might bring these works into the classroom. So I'm just going to kick it off. I have a sort of introductory presentation way of orienting us to ways in which you might think about utopia and dystopia. And then I thought we'd do Q&A and then have a chance to go into breakout rooms and talk about some of the writing assignments and the approaches I take to writing projects when teaching this material. So without further ado, I'm just gonna go right into it. Okay, so like all generations, but arguably more than most, our students are living through a time of profound change. You know this, we know this, political, economic, environmental, and social change. And what I have found is that utopia and dystopia feels particularly relevant in the context of my students' experiences in the world and the ways in which they make sense of those experiences. And this is such an advantage in the literature classroom in that the stakes are clear and everyone is more likely to be invested. I mean, my field of specialization is Renaissance literature. And so often I find myself in the situation of just trying to do my song and dance to convince 21st century students that 16th and 17th century plays and prose romances are things that might be meaningful to them, but it's not as hard when I'm teaching this material. And one of the things that a course in utopia and dystopia can do is remind us over and over again how fiction can be a really powerful way of engaging with and reckoning with the world in which we live, and possibly a way of imagining alternate worlds in which we might one day make our way. I'm really going to try today and next week to speak to the concerns that many of you listed in the surveys that you submitted in advance of our webinar. So many of you spoke about a desire to foster real world engagement with your students, to combat apathy, and to think about ways in which what you're doing in the classroom can kind of connect outward. So I'm going to try to center that while also just offering some tools for teaching the genre. I love teaching Utopia because it's so great to think with, right? All of these texts are kind of thought experiments that can extend into classroom discussion and also into a variety of individual writing projects in all kinds of marvelous ways. So there's this really nice synergy between like the stuff you're reading, the conversations you're having, and the kinds of writing we might be asking the students to do. Utopias are always prompting readers to adopt alternate perspectives and think critically about the home or the place from which they have come. This is what I would call the practical orientation of the kinds of utopia classes that I teach. And when I teach Utopia, the final project is always one in which students create their own utopian fiction building on the forms and the themes that we've been studying together. Right? And I think this ability to integrate the reading with the writing, that is the content of the class, with the analysis and the assessment, means hopefully that a Utopia unit can perhaps work well to allow you to satisfy the state standards that I know are so important when you're constructing your units, right? So you can think about the interconnected nature of listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking, right? So Utopia is an opportunity to think about the craft of making and the composition of texts and how that might also shape the composition of their own writing after having studied the texts. The last thing I'll say before I delve into the kind of meat of it and my PowerPoint is that I love teaching Utopia and Dystopia and that I really get to know my own students. I mean, this may be a little bit different for you than it is for me, but I see my students maybe for 150 minutes a week. So less than I imagine the rest of you get to spend time with the students in your classrooms. But what I love about teaching this material is I really get a chance to learn about their hopes and fears, and also their sense of the rules, sort of overt and implicit, that are structuring their lives, right? And how they are processing and responding to those rules, and also just the kind of idealism that they have that I find really actually extremely inspiring. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna share screen. I have a PowerPoint that I'm gonna use to kick it off. Okay, first a little bit about the word utopia. The word utopia was invented by a writer named Sir Thomas More in a book of that name, published in Latin in 1516. And these are images from the earliest Latin and edition of Utopia, and then the first English translation. Yeah. More was a famous English humanist. He was Lord Chancellor to King Henry VIII. And his Utopia is a philosophical text that presents itself as a traveler's tale. It pretends to be a traveler's tale. So its narrator is a fictional traveler who has recently journeyed to an idealized island nation with an apparently perfect political system. And the text is a description of what the traveler has seen there. The name of the island is Utopia. Again, this is a word that More invented by putting together two Greek terms. This word either means no place or not place. So utopos is a no place or a not place. It is possible that this word is also a pun on utopos, which means good place. And it's this tension between a not place and a good place that is really important to the genre of utopia throughout its long history. But what I really want to emphasize is utopia is a no place. It is a no place or a not place. A 16th century reader of this text, like an early reader, called it a way of patterning a commonwealth. And now we often give the name utopia to any work that describes an ideal commonwealth whose inhabitants exist under seemingly perfect conditions. Now, this kind of fiction, the description of an ideal commonwealth, is far older than the name utopia. For example, Plato's Republic could be called a utopian fiction. It features a dialogue in which Socrates imagines a perfectly just state, right? So this kind of story is old, but Thomas More gives the genre its name, and he also gives it the narrative form of the traveler's tale. Now, for a long, long time, readers have asked the question, what if the utopia that you're reading, does not seem to be a good place? Right? What if the Commonwealth described doesn't seem to be very good? Can it still be called a utopia? For many 20th century and 21st century readers, the answer to that question is no. That is, if it's not good, you can't call it a utopia. This led to the widespread use of the term dystopia to describe certain literary productions, such as Brave New World and also Orwell's 1984, which are two of the most frequently taught 20th century utopias. The word dystopia was coined by another Englishman named John Stuart Mill, who first used the word in 1868 in a parliamentary debate describing a bad place. But the word didn't enter common currency until the 20th century. Some critics say that dystopia becomes the prevalent form of utopian fiction in the 20th century. Certainly after the horrors of World War I, bleaker forms of utopia began to predominate. After, it's a nightmare century. You don't need me to tell you this, right? After the mass killing of two catastrophic world wars, there was no longer a widespread faith in technological process or the progress of reason and science. And after the rise of the Soviet Union, there was also a sense among European and American intellectuals that social collectivism had massively failed. In responding to this new mood, the utopias of the 20th century have often been correspondingly bleak, with the brief exception of a really interesting series of works published by left-leaning political radicals and feminists in the 1970s. This was the decade following the rise of the radical student movement, during which time there was a new surge of optimism about social reform. Nevertheless, many 20th century utopias feature a quasi-omnipotent, monolithic, totalitarian state, one that demands complete obedience. This state relies on scientific and technological advances to ensure social control. Over the course of the fiction, this state might be challenged by some vestigial forms of individualization, but never successfully. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that this term dystopia, its use has become commonplace as a way of describing such fictions. Nevertheless, not everyone agrees about whether and how it should be assigned to particular literary texts. For example, some scholars argue that utopia is always inherently dystopian, right? It's always been bad. Because the desire to create an improved society, the desire to create an improved society implies this like drift towards punitive methods of controlling human behavior, which inexorably results in some sort of police state. So what's I think one of the most key lines in Thomas More's Utopia, in the description of the island, we're told that residents of Utopia cannot choose but be good because they're always in view of their neighbors. There's no private property, but also no privacy, right? So this idea of mass surveillance is present in the concept of utopia from its very beginning. Right? So some scholars have argued, oh, utopia was always bad. In addition, whether or not any given reader thinks a utopia is either good or bad depends on their perspective, right? So it's difficult to assert that this text is a good place and this text is a bad place if that judgment can alter depending on one's cultural or historical situation. In addition, many early utopias already seem satirical in intention. Like it's not at all clear that they're sincere or sincerely intend that the commonwealths they describe to be taken as an ideal model. So what I say to my students, I set up this as a problem, right? This problem of judgment. And I say our task as literary scholars is not only to make evaluative decisions, that is, we aren't only here to say this society is good, this society is bad, this plan for human life is practical, this plan is obviously impractical and it would never work. But rather, our work in the literature classroom is to think about how these texts work as literary inventions. How are they made? And how are they kind of communicating certain ideas to their readers? So I spend a lot of time talking about the idiom of utopia. That is, its literary qualities and its distinctive set of traits. And I've listed some of the key ones here. Well, first, a utopia often describes an imaginary society in some detail, focusing on the rituals that constitute social life. Right? There's a lot, the main character is often the place in texts like these. That society is always isolated. Isolation is key. Isolated on an island initially, eventually some other remote location, including other planets, or perhaps other time periods. So time travel becomes a way of achieving the isolation that's so key to the genre, right? So over the last 500 years or so, since Thomas More first published Utopia, the journey to the no place has increasingly tended to be a journey in time as well as a journey in space. So we get these visions of the future and not of a society located in some isolated part of our planet. Again, as in the term utopia, which means no place, these texts are always created through an act of negation, right? So some feature of the author's world is negated or eliminated, and then the fiction explores like the consequences of that removal. So in Thomas More's Utopia, there's no private property. That's the like fundamental negation. And then once that's gone, all kinds of other things follow from that initial core removal. And utopias often work in the same way. They take one significant thing from the world of the reader, remove it, and then describe what life would be like without that core thing. Utopian fictions often begin when a first-person narrator is given a tour of the alien society, and the story is made up of a kind of philosophical dialogue between the guide and the narrator, who's a stranger. These descriptions stress the legal or technological structure of the alien societies. And again, the focus tends to be on the society as a whole, not on individual varieties of existence within that society. So infamously, in Thomas More's Utopia, you never get a first-person description of what it would be like to live there, right? You only get general descriptions of what the society as a whole is like and how it's organized. This tour of the utopian society is often contained within a frame story. And this is the stuff I'm really interested in as a reader, right? So the outer frame is some kind of like imaginary voyage that strands the traveler on the island in question. And then the apparatus of the text reinforces that fictional frame, right? So Thomas More pretends like the utopia is a true report from a traveler named Raphael Hifliday, who returned and can share the news of what he found. And this is an alphabet, the utopian alphabet, which was included as part of the published apparatus of the text, in addition to various woodcut maps. Utopian fictions are usually narrated by a traveler who's discovered the new community by accident. The traveler then learns about the alien culture through a series of dialogues with the hosts, and through these dialogues is then instructed in the habits and the rituals of that society. Here's another woodcut. The narrative, in this way, the narrative of a utopia operates dramatically, right? The review of the new society is conflicting with the normal expectations of the narrator and the reader, right? So for example, in one of the most infamous moments in More's Utopia, Hifliday learns that children are raised to disdain gold and jewels, right, as being signs of childishness. And so in Utopia, their toilets, their chamber pots are made of gold, right, as this like sign of the disgust for wealth and private property that's promulgated through the system, right? And so you have such kind of shocking moments like that will pop up in utopias that are contrasting to what would be the normal expectations of a reader who comes to these texts. And part of the fun or the interest generated by these stories is the kind of contrast between what you might expect of normal social life and what you find on the island of Utopia. In this way, Utopia operates as a form of estrangement, as a kind of genre of estrangement, right? And it's this fiction of geographical and temporal distance, right? The conceit that the traveler has gone somewhere far away and extremely different, right? This fiction allows the reader to start noticing all of the rules and rituals that constitute ordinary life at home, right? Because they're implicitly always comparing what they would expect to find based on their own life and what is found in the space of the utopia. Right? So this is a kind of characteristic experience of reading Utopia is you go far away in order to better understand the place from which you come. Now, the European exploration and colonization of the New World of the Americas was just beginning in Moore's lifetime, and the genre is influenced by this exploration, right? But it is markedly different from the kinds of reports that were often brought back from the New World, in that the traveler to Utopia, when they get there, they find they're the savage. And the place where they've gone is far more sophisticated than the home from which they've departed, right? These are complex, highly evolved societies, more politically and technologically sophisticated. So it's often the explorer who's the so-called primitive when they arrive in Utopia. And again, in this way, utopian fiction starts to problematize the culture out of which it emerges, right? It throws traditional forms of power off balance. This deconstruction of the hierarchy between the ideas of the civilized and ideas of the savage is one of the key features of utopian fiction, right? And from Thomas More onwards, there's this like strong investment in making it very, very difficult for any reader to hold tight to the certainty that they come from a civilized place, right? And everywhere else is barbarous or savage in some way, right? Utopias are kind of always deconstructing that fantasy, right? In the 20th, oh, these are just some possible descendants of the genre. In the 20th and 21st centuries, utopias and their descendants within the science fiction genre have often focused more and more on science and technology rather than on revolutionary social programs, imagining worlds of technological domination in which technology has transmogrified the body in particular. So these utopias feature prostheses, clones, implants, replicants, and the erasure of the boundaries between the organic and the mechanical. Right? So just in the way that the earliest utopias are troubling the boundary between the civilized and the savage, contemporary works in this genre are really making uncertain the distinction between the organic and the mechanical. Okay. So assuming you accept this initial picture of the form of utopia and how it works, there are some questions or problems that emerge from this definition, and I want to outline them here. And I always say this outright at the very beginning of term, and I'm like, this is what we're going to wrestle with for as long as we're reading this material. First, why use fiction to outline a social program, right? When you read these texts, you feel very, very keenly that the artist or the writer of the utopia feels very urgently that something is terribly wrong, right? And they want to explore ways of responding to things that are wrong in their world, right? And if that is the case, like if that is part of the purpose of utopia, why would these writers and artists use fiction to respond to that situation? What is the purpose of outlining a new social program through fiction? Does the use of fiction have the effect of trivializing any political program that animates the utopian text, right? Does it make it seem trivial? Or is it because that the only way to imagine a better society is through artistic invention? Is that actually the only way to create an alternative? So that's kind of question one. A second question is, where does the author stand? How sincere are these texts, right? Are they ironic or satirical or totally like straight ahead programs? It's really, really difficult to know. And kind of trying to map the relationship between the author and the text itself introduces a really interesting set of questions and problems around intention in fiction. How seriously should we take these stories? Are they simply just a kind of a game, or are they meant with more seriousness? Um, can we actually imagine a better world? Is that even possible? And lastly, are utopias ever really good, ideal, or perfect? Um, and again, the genre kind of has these persistent set of themes that are these binaries that are getting complicated and exploded. Real, not real. Is this story true or is it made up? The frame stories are constantly like a buzz around whether or not it's true that these events happen. So it introduces the problem of reality, non-reality, civilized savage, as I've already dwelled on, human animal, human machine, biological mechanical, but also freedom, stability, often the choice, the implicit choice being offered readers of these texts is what freedoms would you give up in order to achieve a certain amount of stability in your society? And then also evolution, devolution, right? Is human life on a kind of trajectory towards improvement or towards catastrophe? So when I teach Utopia, I teach it through a series of creative assignments. So I used to, like when I first started teaching the class, I gave exams and had them write essays and do passage identifications. And then I started to alter that, those assignments, and now even in the like massive 300-person class, I have them do a series of creative assignments that ask the students to adopt the various forms of utopia in order to wrestle with these problems and questions, right? And so the students are always being encouraged to think about the form of the text as like a tool that they can pick up and use in their own written work and in their own imaginative inventions. And so I'm gonna just quickly zip through some of the texts that are often on my syllabus. I realize that you all are gonna have different needs in your classroom, different sorts of things you can assign. And this is just a kind of array of things you might consider including. So I often teach part 4 of Gulliver's Travels, which is an early 18th century text featuring the fictional adventures of a ship captain named Lemuel Gulliver. In the 4th part of Gulliver's Travels, he travels to the island of the Winhams. The Winhams are extremely perfectly rational creatures whose bodies look exactly like what Gulliver would call a horse. So he thinks he's arrived on an island of horse people, right? And the island is also populated by a number of savage and depraved beings that look exactly like human beings, that have the shape of human beings, but are known as yahoos. And it's a great way to explore not only human animal relations, but questions of hyper rationality, and whether a world that is organized entirely based on the dictates of reason is a better organized world. I also teach, I'm going to advocate for Erewhon. If any of you are intrigued, Samuel Butler's Erewhon, it was published in 1872. Butler was a colonist and sheep farmer in New Zealand. And the germ of Erewhon started in a series of newspaper articles he published in a New Zealand newspaper, in which he engaged with the, at that time, very new and very controversial theory of evolution, which had just been published and popularized by Charles Darwin. And Erewhon, which is nowhere spelled backwards, is the story of a society that becomes convinced that machines will evolve and eventually enslave all of humanity. And so the Erewhonians just fight a revolution and decide to destroy every single machine, so the machines can't enslave them. But right in the middle of this book are 3 chapters called The Book of the Machines, in which the anti-machinist philosopher applies the principles of Darwin's theory of evolution in order to argue that by implication, that theory of natural selection means that machines will one day evolve to take over. And those 3 books are super easily excerpted. They teach incredibly well, really fun kind of conversations about what is the nature of consciousness, how do we talk about agency, and it connects obviously to all kinds of science fiction like Terminator, et cetera, et cetera. Ooh, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is a nice short little novella from 1896. Dr. Moreau is a vivisector who's been in disgrace because of his controversial experiments, and he is sent to an isolated island where he operates on animals in order to try to turn them into humans. And it's a really sort of dark and gothic fantasy that is directly evoking not only Utopia, but Shakespeare's The Tempest, and this question of whether or not science can triumph over what many worry were the essential animal natures of human beings. And like Gulliver's Travels, it's a chance to think about the boundaries between the animal and the human. This text, Imperium in Imperio, written by a Baptist preacher named Sutton E. Griggs. He sold this book going door to door throughout the South. The title means empire within an empire, or perhaps a nation within a nation. It imagines that at the time of the American Revolution, a number of Black Americans found in secret an alternate commonwealth in hiding in Waco, Texas. And that Imperium in Imperio, the nation within a nation, grows and thrives and survives up to the end of the 19th century, where the question is whether they will finally reveal themselves. And it provides a Southern Black perspective on politics during and immediately after Reconstruction. And this is the text that I pair with the manifesto for education, for an educational system that I think I shared with you guys in the Google Drive. Brave New World, probably you know about this one, published in 1932. A quote, an allusion again to Shakespeare's Tempest. The world described is 600 years after Ford. So Ford And the factories in which the Model T were first produced has become the new model for the nation. It takes place in what we would call the 26th century. And in this future society, we have eugenic engineering, and that coupled with a kind of behavioral hypnosis ensures that a rigidly hierarchical class society can remain totally stable. So babies are engineered to have a certain degree of intelligence and to be fit towards certain kinds of work. And then after they're born, they're sort of hypnotized to always feel as if they're in exactly the right place, doing the labor that the society needs them to do, right? And the entire world is structured around industrial mass production. Oh yeah, Minority Report. I think this could be really great in some of your classrooms. This is published in 1956 by Philip K. Dick, one of the most important and influential science fiction writers of the post-war period. He's a famously anxious and paranoid writer, and many of his works deal with the confusion of identity and the question about the nature of reality. So a lot of his texts include drug-induced hallucinations, but also robots and androids that are always wondering if they're human or if they're androids, mystical visions, and alternate or artificial worlds. Now, Minority Report is a short story that posits or imagines a future America in which crime has been entirely abolished. There's no more crime. And this is because a group of three mentally disabled people have the wild talent of seeing crimes before they happen. So they're kind of clairvoyant and can see crimes before they happen. And these people are wired to a network of computers. And when they have their visions, the computer sort of processes them and spits out a card on the basis of which future or would-be criminals can be arrested and shipped to internment camps before they commit their crimes, right? So the story is linking brain damage to computer science, and it's raising a whole host of questions for moral philosophy, including the question of when guilt happens, right? When is the moment that you're guilty of a crime? And can you be guilty of a crime before you actually commit it? And again, this is like sort of like Erewhon. This is a text that leads to really kind of cool debates with the students about the nature of free will and whether or not free will exists and how to assign moral responsibility in a society where there may not be free will. Handmaid's Tale, another great one, published in 1985. It's a thriller and a psychological story. Atwood herself prefers the term speculative fiction. She's also called the novel A Warning. It envisions a right-wing theocratic coup having taken place in the northeastern United States of the early 21st century. The major national issue is the widespread sterility of the population, which seems to be the result of nuclear and chemical pollution. And Gilead addresses this problem through sexual surrogacy, turning its few fertile women into handmaids to its highest level commanders and their wives. This is a text every semester I'll have 5 or 10 students who just live for Margaret Atwood. And this is just a text that I think is just really, really meaningful for people. And again, it teaches very well. The last one, I'm almost done with my survey, is this text. This would be a little more out there, but it's called Dance Dance Revolution. It was published in 2007. And it's written by the American poet Cathy Park Hong. And the text is a collection of poems that's invented in this futuristic fiction plot. You know, and this is, again, a chance to think about globalization and questions of identity in a world that has really been flattened by migration and global systems of communication. And then I think for next week when we meet again, I'll talk in more detail about two short stories that I also recommend. One by Ursula Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and the other by N.K. Jemisin, a response to Le Guin called The Ones Who Stay and Fight. And um, I have other short stories I think I can recommend because I know a lot of you are looking for shorter texts that you can bring into the classroom. But again, I think the thing that I really want to center with students when I teach this material is always to be asking, like, what are utopias for? How can fiction help us see and know our own world and figure out how we want to live in it, right? That's the kind of the frame that I like to give it.